Go find another table. This one is for family, not adopted girls. My cousin Brianna's voice rang through the elegant dining room of the vintage cellar, Napa Valley's most exclusive, Michelin-starred restaurant. Laughter erupted around the heavy oak table. My Aunt Kimberly, Uncle Charles, and Brianna's husband all joined in, like it was the funniest joke they had ever heard. I stood there, clutching my silk clutch, my face burning as other wealthy diners turned to stare. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, but I felt ice in my veins. My name is Madison, and I am 27 years old. I have lived with this family for 22 years, ever since they adopted me when I was 5. 22 years of being a footnote in a story that was never mine. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I would love to know who is part of our community. Brianna, that is enough, I said quietly, trying to hold on to the last shred of my dignity. I took a seat anyway, ignoring the way Aunt Kimberly pointedly shifted her designer clutch to create a physical barrier between us. This dinner was supposed to celebrate Brianna's latest business deal, a vineyard investment that our aunt and uncle had fully financed. As usual, they were helping Brianna climb a ladder they had built for her. When I had asked for a small loan to jumpstart my sustainable architecture firm 3 years ago, they laughed and told me to get a real job. The evening dragged on like a slow-motion wreck. Brianna bragged about her new Porsche and their upcoming vacation to the Amalfi Coast. My aunt and uncle beamed with pride, hanging on her every word. When I tried to mention that my firm had just won a national award for green infrastructure, Aunt Kimberly cut me off before I could finish the sentence. That is nice, dear. Charles, tell us more about that vintage Cabernet you are eyeing for the cellar. By the time dessert arrived, I had retreated into that familiar, protective numbness. I realized then that I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long. Then, the waiter approached with a check. My stomach dropped as he placed the leather folder directly in front of me. I stared at it, confused. What is this? I asked. Brianna's laugh was sharp and bright, like breaking glass. Oh, didn't we mention? You are paying tonight. Consider it your contribution to the family, since you are always taking and never giving. Taking? The word felt clinical, like an error on a balance sheet. I had never asked them for anything since I turned 18. The roof over your head, the food, the clothes, Aunt Kimberly said, ticking items off her fingers. We gave you everything, Madison. The least you can do is buy us dinner. I opened the folder. The total was nothing compared to my firm's revenue, but the sheer audacity of their greed made my blood boil. $6,540. They had ordered the most expensive vintages and premium steaks, thinking they could still treat me like their personal ATM. You expect me to fund your extravagance, Uncle Charles? I asked, my voice cold and steady. Of course you can, he said sweetly. You just told us about your big award. Surely that came with a bonus. I looked at their smug, greedy faces. Anger was not loud this time. It was precise. I did not cry. I did not beg. I pulled out my credit card and placed it in the folder. I signed the receipt for $6,540 with a steady hand, the price of my final exit from their charade. I forced a smile, took a slow sip of my water, and watched them. They were not shocked by what they had done. They were just satisfied that I was still playing along. The vintage cellar smelled like damp earth, expensive cork, and the cold reality of a bad investment. As I sat there, the weight of the payment I had just made felt like a physical chain breaking. I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a creditor who was finally closing a delinquent account. For 22 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and my compassion was a luxury they had overdrafted for years. I looked at Aunt Kimberly, who was now laughing as she told a story about Brianna's high school prom, a night where I stayed home to supervise the bottling line because it was good for my character. I realized then that they had spent decades normalizing cruelty. It is a subtle trap. When a family stops seeing a child as a human being and begins seeing them as a high-yield utility, the abuse becomes a mundane part of the business plan. To Kimberly and Charles, my existence was not about love. It was about efficiency. I was the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who could handle things so they did not have to. I remembered when I was 16, spending my entire summer in the humid offices of the estate. I had spent months designing a sustainable irrigation system for the West Ridge. It was complex work, involving soil analysis and topography maps. When I finished, Uncle Charles did not give me a hug or a thank you. He took my blueprints to the Napa Valley Agricultural Board and told them it was Brianna's visionary project for her college application. Brianna could not even point to the West Ridge on a map, but her name was etched into the award. I was just the ghost who kept the vines from dying. The double standards were always calculated down to the penny. When it came time for college, they told me they were strapped for cash and that I needed to be realistic. I worked 3 jobs: waitressing, tutoring, and cleaning kennels just to pay for my community college tuition. Meanwhile, they were spending $50,000 on Brianna's sorority fees and designer handbags. They told me they could not afford my engineering textbooks. But a week later, a new Porsche appeared in the driveway for Brianna's 21st birthday. My upbringing was not a childhood. It was a long-term lease on my labor and my soul. I had spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. I kept wondering what I had ever done wrong, but the balance sheet was clear now. This was not a family. It was a predatory contract. And as I watched them celebrate their stolen success, I realized that the silence they had enforced on me for 2 decades was about to become my most lethal weapon. I was not just a survivor anymore. I was a strategist. And I was about to audit every single lie they had ever told. The laughter around the table started to fade as the family stood up to leave. Brianna was already checking her reflection in her phone, adjusting her designer silk scarf with a smug grin. "Well, that was a lovely donation, Madison," she smirked. "Maybe next time, if you are lucky, we will let you sit at the grown-up end of the table where the real family talks." I did not answer. I just sat there, my hands folded on my lap, watching my life's work being dismissed. But just as Uncle Charles reached for his coat, a voice cut through the chatter like a surgical blade. "Just a moment, please?" Everyone froze. Great-grandmother Margaret, who had been silent all evening, was standing at her end of the table. At 78 years old, she still commanded the room. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as she adjusted her silver hair, her expression unreadable and cold. "Mother, what is it?" Aunt Kimberly asked, irritation creeping into her voice. "We were just about to head home." "Sit down, all of you," Margaret said. Her voice carried an authority that made even Uncle Charles straighten in his chair and obey without a word. "I have something to say, and you are going to listen." She pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from her purse. It looked official, notarized, and lethal. "I am 78 years old, and I have spent the past few months thinking about my legacy," she began. "I have been thinking about where my money should go when I am gone." The table went very still. I watched Brianna's face light up with an ugly, naked greed. She had been counting on this inheritance for years. "We all know how the current will works," Margaret continued. "The bulk of my estate goes to Kimberly, then distributed among the grandchildren. That is what it says." Margaret's gaze swept across each of them before landing on me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine respect in her eyes. "But I have had my lawyer draw up a new will, signed and notarized yesterday." The silence was suffocating. "You cannot be serious," Uncle Charles said, his face going pale. "You are changing your will because of a stupid joke? A joke?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I have watched you all mock and belittle Madison for over 2 decades. I have watched you exclude her, humiliate her, and tonight you made her pay for your excess while you laughed about it. You think making someone feel worthless is entertainment?" She walked slowly around the table until she stood beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Madison is the only one in this family who has shown true character," she said. "She has built a business from nothing with no help from any of you. She is kind, talented, and resilient despite your best efforts to break her spirit." "Mother, you are being dramatic," Aunt Kimberly pleaded. "You are talking about billions of dollars. Madison is not even really family." "Stop," Margaret commanded. "Madison is more family than any of you have ever been. She has earned this not through blood, but through being a better person than all of you combined." I sat frozen, unable to process the number that came next. My entire estate, every dollar, every vineyard, every investment, totaling $150 million, is going to Madison. The explosion was immediate. Brianna shrieked, jumping to her feet, her perfect facade crumbling into rage. Uncle Charles slammed his hand on the table, but Margaret did not even blink. She pulled out her phone and made a single, decisive call. Thomas, it is Margaret. Yes. File the new will immediately. More importantly, prepare the immediate power of attorney and appoint Madison as the managing trustee of my living trust. This was not a family drama anymore. It was an accounting, and the balance had just shifted forever. The restaurant erupted into a frenzy of high-decibel greed. Brianna's face was a map of raw panic as she lunged toward the table. "You manipulative little snake!" she shrieked at me. Aunt Kimberly was no better, her manicured hands trembling as she pointed a finger at Great-grandmother Margaret. "She is sick, Mother! She does not know what she is saying! Madison has obviously been poisoning your mind for months." I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I simply stood up and helped Margaret toward the exit. The family connection was not a safety net. It was a security vulnerability I had just patched. Their anger was not about a betrayal of love. It was about the sudden loss of a guaranteed revenue stream. To them, I was no longer the reliable servant. I was a hostile takeover. By the time we reached the sleek black car waiting at the curb, my phone was already vibrating with a barrage of notifications. 43 missed calls from Brianna, 27 from Aunt Kimberly, dozens of texts ranging from pleading for a family talk to threatening to destroy my career. I did not answer a single one. I went straight back to Margaret's estate and met with Walter, her head of legal. "They will claim undue influence and diminished capacity," Walter said, spreading a series of medical evaluations across the mahogany desk. But Margaret had 3 separate doctors certify her mental acuity just yesterday morning. The will is ironclad. I looked at the documents, my mind working with clinical precision. It was time for the professional escalation. I was not just reacting, I was moving the pieces of a game they did not even realize we were playing. Using the managing trustee authority Margaret had just signed over, I instructed Walter to immediately freeze all liquid family assets and revoke Uncle Charles's executive authority over the main vineyard operations. For years, they had used the estate as a personal piggy bank while I struggled through my firm's early years, living on ramen just to keep my vision alive. That subscription was now canceled. The retaliation from Kimberly and Charles was swift and toxic. They did not apologize, they doubled down. By the next morning, they had leaked a story to the local press, screaming headlines about a billionaire disinheriting her family for an adopted girl. They hired a private investigator to dig through my professional history, hoping to find a single crack in my reputation as an architect. I sat in the estate study, the room smelling of old books and cold determination. I watched their desperate maneuvers on my laptop. Anger was not a roar anymore. It was a cold, calculating balance sheet. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for decades, and now the account was closed. As I authorized Walter to file a formal trespass notice against them, I realized they were not shocked by their own cruelty. They were just shocked that I had stopped being a line item they could ignore. Walter walked into the study, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind him with a sound that felt final. He carried a leather-bound file that looked like it had been pulled from a vault. "Numbers do not lie, Madison," he said, his voice as sharp as a razor. "People do. But eventually, the math catches up with the fiction." He opened the file to a section from 22 years ago. "When your birth parents passed away, they left a trust fund specifically for your care and education. The initial balance was $1,500,000. I looked at the bank statements. Aunt Kimberly and Uncle Charles were listed as the sole trustees. By the time I turned 12, the account had been drained to nearly zero. They stole from a child who had just lost everything," Walter continued, pointing to a series of wire transfers. $1,500,000 had been funneled into Brianna's private school tuition, Uncle Charles's failed real estate ventures, and the very Porsche that Brianna bragged about at dinner. They had spent my parents' legacy on Brianna's mediocrity, while telling me I was a worthless burden for needing food and clothes. But that was not the kill shot. Walter pulled out a soil analysis report from 3 years ago, the same year my father's original heritage vines on the West Ridge began to die. "The laboratory results came back yesterday," Walter said. "The vines did not die of natural causes." They were systematically poisoned with a high concentrate herbicide. I stared at the chemical reports, the room smelling of old paper, and the metallic scent of betrayal. Aunt Kimberly and Charles had intentionally destroyed the heritage grapes my biological father had spent his life cultivating. They did it to devalue the land 3 years ago, the moment I gained full legal control of the trust at age 25, effectively preventing me from ever making the vineyard profitable on my own. They stole my past and tried to poison my future. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I felt a cold, clinical clarity take over. This was not a family drama anymore. It was a crime scene. They were not just ungrateful. They were predators who had treated my life like a high-yield utility. The $6,540 dinner bill they forced me to pay was just the interest on a debt they could never fully repay. I looked at Walter and nodded once. File the charges. Subpoena, the soil records, and the trust fund audit. I want them to realize that their entire life was a house of cards built on my parents' blood. My compassion was a luxury they had long ago overdrafted, and now I was coming for every cent of the principal. The next evening, Brianna decided to play her final card. She went live on the Napa Valley Insider podcast, a platform she usually used to brag about her social life. This time, she was playing the martyr. I watched the stream from my office, my laptop screen glowing with her artificial tears. My adopted sister, has brainwashed our grandmother. She sobbed to over 10,000 live viewers. She is a professional manipulator who is trying to steal a family legacy that has existed for a century. We are the real victims here. I did not call in to argue. I did not send a cease and desist letter. I simply authorized Walter to release the cloud link containing the trust fund audit and the soil toxicity reports directly into the live stream's comment section. As the viewers began clicking the link, the tide shifted with the speed of a flash flood. The comments turned lethal in seconds. Brianna's face went from pale to a frantic, blotchy red as she realized the narrative was slipping. What about the allegations that your parents stole trust fund money meant for Madison? The host asked, reading a comment. Brianna snapped. The facade of the polished socialite disintegrated, replaced by the raw, ugly entitlement I had lived with for 22 years. That money was ours, she shrieked, forgetting the camera was still rolling. We earned it by raising her ungrateful soul for 22 years. We deserve every cent of that $1,500,000 for the privilege of letting her into our home. The chat went silent for a heartbeat before exploding in absolute condemnation. Brianna had just confessed to a federal crime on a recorded line. I watched as two uniformed officers entered the podcast studio in the background. My Aunt Kimberly and Uncle Charles were already in handcuffs at the estate's gate. As I closed the laptop, I realized why their world had collapsed so fast. It was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. People like Kimberly and Charles do not actually have power. They only have the appearance of it, which they rent with other people's money. When that money, my money, was pulled back, they were revealed for what they truly were: hollow shells with no foundation of character. They were not losing their status. They were finally being forced to live within the means of their own poor ethics. I stood by the window, watching the sunset over the vines. This was not a breakdown. It was a long overdue audit. The villains had not just lost their fortune. They had lost the only thing they ever truly valued, the lie that they were better than everyone else. The winter frost finally thawed, but the silence at the estate was heavier than ever. Margaret passed away on a Tuesday morning, the sun streaming through the tall windows of the study, just as she had always wanted. Her last words were not about the $150 million or the sprawling vineyards. They were about the peace of knowing the legacy was finally in the right hands. I did not waste time on traditional grief. I channeled it into the Eleanor Foundation. We used the $1,500,000 recovered from the civil suit to build a sanctuary for adopted children who had been exploited by the very people who were supposed to protect them. I stood on the West Ridge, watching the first green shoots of the heritage vines finally start to push through the soil, my father's true inheritance, finally breathing again. Down the long, winding driveway, a single moving truck carried away the last of Aunt Kimberly and Uncle Charles's rented life. They were moving to a small, cramped apartment in a neighborhood they used to mock. Without my savings to subsidize their ego, their status had evaporated like morning mist over the valley. I realized then that the best revenge was not the lawsuit or the public humiliation. It was the simple, undeniable fact of my success. I had become everything they said I could not be, while they had become exactly who they always were beneath the money, hollow. I was not just a survivor anymore. I was the architect of a future that no longer had a seat for them. This story reminds us that those who try to dim your light will eventually be swallowed by their own darkness. Do not forget to hit share to spread the power of justice.